So about 2 years ago, I made a video explaining my complicated relationship with Persona 4. I had to split the video into 2 sections because I simultaneously loved and hated a lot of things about it. It did a lot of good for itself and the series, but also made a lot of changes that I wasn't a fan of that would become and still continue to be the current standard. Even to this day, I go back and forth in my head about this game. Sometimes I love it, sometimes I can't stand it. On some days it's my second favorite Persona game, on other days it's my second least favorite. I've come to a realization though. See, I actually love Persona 4 Golden. I just don't love Persona 4 nearly as much. In fact, most of the problems I have with Persona 4 stem from the original game's design. If I had to sum up my biggest grievance with the original Persona 4, it's that it just does not feel like a substantial improvement from Persona 3 in my eyes.
Alright, I get it!
So imagine this. I just finished Persona 3. I think it's pretty good, but there are definitely areas where it could have improved. Persona 4 rarely does that. Anything that did change mostly amounted to removing things that I had no complaints about, usually in the interest of simplifying the game, but ultimately resulting in a drier gameplay loop. However, it's been years since I've even touched the original Persona 4, so I figured it wouldn't hurt to give the game a revisit to see exactly how much of the original differed from its modern re-release, and if it was truly better or worse than I remembered it being. I won't really be talking about the story or any of the problems I have with Persona 4 as a whole, since I already did that in my retrospective. Instead, I'm mainly going to be focusing on where Persona 4 and Persona 4 Golden differ, and the areas where I personally think one excels at over the other. This will not be a comprehensive list of changes between the two versions. If you want something like that, you're better off watching a dedicated comparison video. If you want a specific recommendation, I'd suggest Austin SV's comparison of every version of the game. Not just the original and Golden, but also every version of Golden on every platform. As for me, I'll just be covering the points that I think matter the most. Now to get into more of the specifics. Let's start with the social sim part of the game. This is probably the most unchanged thing between Persona 3 and 4. Usually not for the better. To be clear, I'm not talking about Persona 3 Reload, if that wasn't already obvious. I'm comparing the original Persona 4 to the original Persona 3 and Persona 3 FES. Persona 3 was always pretty barren in terms of day and night activities outside of social links, and Persona 4 really doesn't get much better. Your number of options during the day are effectively about the same. That's not the bad part though. The real stinger is how this game decided to handle night activities. So in Persona 3, you really only had Paulownia Mall to grind your social parameters or dungeon crawling. In Persona 4, you can't even go outside at night. Most of your social stat things are confined to your room, and going outside will simply give you the option to either go to certain night social links, or go fishing. Dungeon crawling now also eats up an entire day instead of just your night, which I've never been a fan of. The one thing I'll give Persona 4 is that they made Justice and Hierophant night social links, in addition to Devil and Tower, which were already night links in Persona 3 FES. I can see what they were trying to do. They basically condensed your night hub, but tried to keep the options effectively the same. However, the inability to even go into town to buy items, use the Velvet Room, or turn in quests is pretty inconvenient. It doesn't feel like there was much of an expansion to what Persona 3 did. It feels more like one step forward, 2 steps back. I guess there is an argument to be made that Inaba is a small town out in the boonies with nothing to do, so it only makes sense that your activities would be limited. Except Persona 4 Golden already turns this idea on its head. Golden adds a plethora of new activities for the player without contradicting this narrative. It's because there's nothing super exciting to do that the main character is forced to get innovative in how he finds ways to spend time. Hell, it's established in the original that the characters go to the nearest city to hang out sometimes, and you can actually go to that city in Golden. I like having the option to spend your night just talking with your social links. No rank ups, just short little conversations. You might even learn something new about a character you wouldn't have known about them otherwise, You can go bug catching and then use said bugs as fishing bait in this game instead of the leftover food from cooking. Fishing itself has been expanded, as you can now fish from the ocean as well as the riverbank for a bigger variety of fish. You can tend to your garden for some worthwhile battle items. I know it's cheesy, but it really is the little things in life that add up. Just like my Patreon supporters on screen right now. It's only $1 to join the club. Huge thanks. And if you're really out of stuff to do, you can work at the bar and listen to people complain. Speaking of which, I really like these two NPCs at night. An employee and his boss who constantly pressures him to go drinking with them. The employee is annoyed by it at first, but then actually starts to miss him when the boss isn't able to drink with him for a while. There's also this old man who strolls up and down the street at night. He takes it upon himself as his personal duty to keep watch of this town and refuses to stop until he croaks, which worries his daughter all the while. Reminds me of the ongoing mini-stories with Persona 3's NPCs, of which I'm quite fond of. It's little subplots like these that I really don't get as much of with the rest of the NPCs in base Persona 4. Half of them just sort of comment on the current point of the story, which is fine and normal for these games, but the other half basically exists just for fetch quests. Not even the interesting kind like in Persona 3 where you're expected to explore and examine places you wouldn't normally have any interest in going to. Finding stuff like the anatomical model or the cocktail drink for Elizabeth come to mind. Most of them are just, get this enemy drop item in the TV world for me. But at least in 3, you could accept and turn in those types of quests straight from the dungeon. Speaking of dungeons, let's get into my grievances with those now. I've already gone into detail in my retrospective about how I'm not a fan of dungeons eating up an entire day, so instead I'm just gonna focus on the dungeons themselves. I'm not gonna hold it against anyone for finding Tartarus in Persona 3 monotonous. Hell, when I first played Persona 3, I basically had nothing to say about the dungeon design. It wasn't until I played Persona 4 when I started to realize that I was looking at these dungeons from the wrong angle. The dungeons themselves were never the selling point. It was all the elements surrounding the dungeon crawling that made it click with me. The way you approached enemies differed depending on the layout of the vicinity and the weapon you had equipped on the protagonist. You could use larger spaces or climb over arches to juke your way around enemies. There were choke points where you could get cornered by shadows and they would enter this alert state, blocking you off from escaping. You could split up your party to find treasures, stairs, or exit points for you. If you spend too long on a floor, the Reaper might catch you at a bad time. Like, at the very least, I had to be conscious while playing Persona 3. In Persona 4, you're just running in straight lines, I guess. Usually for much longer stretches. This is what a floor in a Persona 4 dungeon looks like, and this is what a floor at Tartarus looks like. If you see an enemy, you either get caught or you don't. Some of these guys can turn 180 degrees as soon as you even get close to their backside, and getting player advantages feels really jank. I could strike a shadow directly from behind and not get the advantage, but other times I'll strike them head on and randomly get a player advantage. At that rate, you might as well just charge straight into every enemy and see what you get. And good grief, Yu Narukami's sword swing feels like shit. The range on this thing feels really short, and the swing has no weight behind it. How do you go from 6 totally functional weapon types that all feel natural and fluid even with their different swing speeds and such, to a flimsy little flail? It's just, shit doesn't add up, the math's not mathing. Persona 4 Golden doesn't change all that much in the grand scheme of things, but they did pretty much fix any and all issues with the hit detection on enemies. They got rid of the floating orb shadows and made all of them blobs, and gave the gold hands their own field model. The regular shadows will notice you from behind, but they will always give you a brief second to react before they turn around. It feels a lot more consistent, and every player or enemy advantage feels deserved. The dungeons themselves pretty much stay the same between the original and Golden. Each dungeon has a one-floor gimmick that adds less than nothing. One of them you literally just have to walk backwards. Another is just the way to the stairs is locked, so you gotta take the long way around. One of them just turns off the lights. One of them locks the door to the boss at the end. If you miss the Orb of Darkness on the way up, you gotta go back a few floors. And go through the floor of rotating intersections again.
But I have some bad news. What? You're going back. What? Bye.
Eventually, the game just gives up with gimmicks altogether and just forces you to backtrack at certain points. The only dungeon with an actually meaningful gimmick is, yeah, the one added for Golden. I'm pretty indifferent towards Marie as a character, but the dungeon that comes with her story arc is pretty neat actually. Your SP is halved after every battle, you lose all your items, and you're limited to whatever items and equipment you find within the dungeon. Not saying all the dungeons in the game should have been like this, but damn. The bosses are also pretty neat, as they incentivize you to use the consumable items you find in the dungeon. Although, I guess that's a given with this big of a gimmick imposed on you. Now's a good time to get into combat. Don't get me wrong, I can understand adding an option for direct party commands, but why did we have to give up so much in exchange? Merging all physical skills into a single physical element is just a bad idea. In an RPG where half the skills are going to be physical, having just one physical element kinda breaks everything. You only need one resist passive to cockblock half the attacks in the game. Not being able to see the full turn cycle order is pretty whack. I don't think adding direct control really warrants removing that feature, considering other RPGs with direct control have turn charts. Hell, even some within the same series. You can't scan enemy affinities anymore. For the vast majority of the game, it's just gonna be trial and error. This doesn't make the game harder per se, it just kind of encourages the player to spam physical crits for most of the game. Wait, isn't the game supposed to punish the player for just attacking recklessly? At least that's what SMT was known for. And that's what the one more mechanic is based on. And that's where it hits you. This is literally just SMT press turn at home. Pretty much all the things that gave Persona 3's combat its own identity separate from SMT's press turn were removed. Sure, one more is simpler in concept, but Persona 3 changed the way you approached battles by making you plan several steps ahead, using the turn chart and assigning tactics to your party on the protagonist's turn. What Persona 4 leaves you left with is a very stripped down, bare bones version of that. Now, of course, it'd be stupid of me to expect Persona 4's gameplay to remain exactly the same as 3's, but what does Persona 4 add that gives its combat system identity? Adding direct commands? Most RPGs have that. It's gonna take a lot more than that. Persona 3 foregoing that standard is in very large part what made it special to begin with. Sure, Persona 4 adds follow-up attacks and party member safety nets, but those ultimately just amount to free crits and a bunch of walking, talking homunculus items. Can we also just take a moment to appreciate how in vanilla P4, immediately upon becoming friends, the game is like, this character will now die for you. Like with the dungeon crawling, Persona 4 Golden doesn't really do a whole lot to fix the combat either. Sure, a lot of the day life stuff they added does translate into more options in combat, but they don't really do a whole lot with the battle mechanics. Those are left largely the same. I will say, however, that Golden adds a lot more variety to the player's options. In turn, this does give the game a lot more to stand out compared to the original. Like, I can actually see these things as a good expansion on the foundation laid down by Persona 3. Let's start with party members. The party member skill sets in the original Persona 4 were really uninteresting to me. They're not even bad in a practical sense, most characters serve a very straightforward function. It's just really boring. In most other Persona games, party members lean heavily towards a certain element, but they still have good utility outside of dealing one type of damage. The vast majority of party members feel kinda like they solely exist for their designated element. A good amount of it might just be the result of the physical type merge. It makes roles like Chie and Kanji kinda redundant. Being both strength-oriented characters, this makes their only true unique qualities their magic elements. And their magic is shit. It's really only there if you don't have anyone else who can exploit the enemy's weaknesses. The worst part is that Kanji, the party member with the highest strength stat among your party members, only comes with single target physical skills, and no power charge. That's not all, the vast majority of his skills are elect based, and he has the lowest magic stat of all the characters. Chie is just straight up the better option on every front. In Persona 3, there were merits to using Junpei over Aigis because he had access to multi-target slash skills that Aigis couldn't use. Imagine how much more utility both Chie and Kanji would have if Chie's Gale Slash was actually Slash Elemental, and Kanji's Fizz skills were Pierce attacks that Chie could never use. Yosuke's got the opposite problem. They're trying to make him this jack-of-all-trades party member, but his best physical skill for the vast majority of the game is Sonic Punch. So he's a jack-of-all-trades character who's missing a trade. And it just so happens that these 3 party members are the ones who lose their weaknesses upon Second Awakening in the PS2 version. The only interesting party members in a functional sense are Teddy and Naoto. Teddy's got healing, ice, Mataru Kaja, and Miraku Kaja to play around with, which kinda trivializes Chie and Kanji's attack buffs. Well, there goes that too. Teddy kinda fills a modified Akihiko role, just giving up 1 buff in exchange for party-wide healing. Naoto isn't very good against bosses because elemental spells with boost and amp passives are better than almighty attacks, but she's still a good normal encounter sweeper. You're not really gonna get much use out of her physical skills, but once you get multi-target light and dark spells, she could just insta-kill about anything without resistance. And of course, almighty attacks are best against gold hands who resist all elements typically. Now let's talk about how Golden improved the party members and made your options feel more diverse. Characters do retain their weaknesses after Second Awakening, but I believe the trade-off is actually worth it in this case. Some existing skills were reworked to where you have to progress to a certain point in that party member's social link to get them. However, plenty of new skills were introduced through social link progress as well. Some of these just help enhance their innate capabilities, but some also introduce more diversity into their skill pool. It gives you good incentive to not only do their social links, but also get their bike skills. Teddy gains a few physical skills, which now presents a dilemma where you will have to choose what you want Teddy to lean more into between Fizz, Ice, Healing, and Support. Yukiko gets Divine Grace, which means you can give the Blessed Hands accessory to someone else. She also gets Mind Charge, which is pretty nutty. Naoto becomes a knockdown machine with all the elemental spells at her disposal now, but she still won't be out-damaging other characters with optimized elemental damage. Chie gets Revolution and Apt Pupil for crit builds, as well as Tetra Break, so enemies can't cockblock you with that shit. You can get Power Charge, Atom Smasher, and Mediarama on Kanji. This is honestly pretty interesting and clever design, because Kanji will probably be using a ton of HP on his physical skills. However, his very small SP pool acts as a balancing measure to make sure he doesn't basically have infinite HP. Kanji's massive HP pool also makes healing him up to maximum health a steeper cost, as he cannot exceed medium healing spells. This can incentivize the player to give him the Blessed Hands accessory instead of Yukiko or Teddy. Now you might be thinking, why not just have someone else heal him instead? And okay, look, I realized I kinda wrote myself into a corner with that one, but please, just let me have my fun. The point is, all these additions feel deliberate and sensible for each character's purpose. Except Yosuke, he still sucks. Golden didn't really do much to help him, I'm sorry. The only character I think Golden kind of overcorrected is Rise. In the original PS2 game, she did literally next to nothing. And apparently, you guys need to be educated. As we've established earlier, you can't scan enemies anymore. Rise just keeps track of enemy affinities and skills as you discover them through trial and error. Yeah, Rise, I can do that too with a fucking pen and paper. Even when she does get her weakness scan ability, it's honestly kind of a ripoff. She reveals one weakness at the start of battle that sounds good on paper, until you realize it doesn't actually keep track of it on the enemy's analysis. She only verbally says it, and doesn't say which one.
That one's weak to fire!
Which one, Rise? I know now after doing research, it's apparently the first target your cursor defaults to, but there's no clear indication that's the case. Before you start arguing that scanning in P3 was only necessary because of the party AI, Nocturne and DDS let you analyze enemies at the cost of a press turn, and oh look! You can directly control your characters in this game! Hell, Persona 3 scan took a couple turns. Even in Reload, you had to wait a whole turn before scanning an enemy, and it costs SP per enemy in that game. Most of Risei's other functions are the same as Fuuka's in Persona 3 FES. So she's just Fuuka, but worse. But wait, she's got treasure and enemy radar. But in a game where the dungeons don't really have hidden rooms or passages, those end up being kinda superfluous. The best you can get out of them is knowing whether a chest is inside a room before entering it. But like, I could just open the door and turn around if there's nothing in there? So yeah, she's pretty bad, but there's really only one problem with her. Golden does give her a proper scan, after getting pretty far into her social link, but it's better than nothing. She also has a chance of giving you a random buff, though in my experience, she'll usually go with an attack buff. I think you have to meet certain conditions to get her to buff defense and evasion. She can boost the power of all-out attacks, but honestly, it takes way too many in-game days to even reach the point to where that can become too powerful. She can recover a tiny bit of HP and SP and remove status ailments, block one hit for your entire party if it would have dealt enough damage to kill the protagonist. She can fully revive the protagonist after that if an attack does kill the protagonist. Honestly, most of those last few things sound like they mostly just exist for the Margaret boss fight, who now has 2 turns per cycle instead of 1 now. She's probably the one party member I think Golden kinda goes overboard with. Okay, this next point might not seem like a big deal at first, but I swear it's actually more important than you think. They fucking ruined shuffle time in this game. Now, I know what you're thinking, it's just a minigame, it's not that deep, but I assure you that it goes pretty deep. I mean, you get shuffle time after almost every encounter in these games. It might as well be a part of the gameplay loop at that point. It's also your main way of acquiring personas for fusion fodder. Shuffle time in Persona 3 was this nice, quick, inoffensive bonus after battles. You could get a new persona or earn bonuses for stuff like XP or money. There was a potential to fail and come out with nothing, or even make the Reaper spawn. Well, first of all, you can't even fight the Reaper on your first playthrough in this game. Lame. More importantly, the rewards for shuffle time were considerably dialed back. You can only get personas with the other 2 outcomes being either nothing, or losing all your XP, money, and item rewards after battle. They also add a stupid match 2 and slot machine variant. What sucks is that you won't even know what variant of shuffle time you'll get until after you accept it. If I see these 2 minigames come up, I don't even bother trying, it's just stupid. Now there are other bonuses you can get that occur after shuffle time. Yes, they added a bonus game after the bonus game. Actually no, I lied, it's literally just a coin flip. A major arcana card will be presented to you, and if you choose to take the gamble, you will either get an upright or reverse effect for that arcana. Unfortunately, most of them aren't worth it. Straight up, I sat down with Nam's Compendium one night, the biggest Persona 4 enthusiast I know, and we ranked every effect and arcana chance together. Unless you're abusing save states, I'd probably just ignore more than half of these effects. Most of them just amount to increase or decrease a random persona stat. The only stats that are worth caring about are strength and magic. Some of them are just straight up nothing burgers like restore all HP or reduce everyone to 1 HP. Then you have death. Don't ever go for this one unless you're literally all out of SP. And I mean completely drained, not at half SP or even a quarter of your SP. This card will either take all of your HP and recover all of your SP, or take all your SP and recover all your HP. Oh, and then you get warped out of the dungeon no matter what. Isn't that great? If you want to gamble your SP, you're better off waiting on a judgment card. Arcana chance is something that in most cases, you're better off just not bothering with. And if you've already gotten all the personas you can get through shuffle time in that dungeon, you're basically gonna be ignoring that too. The way Persona 4 Golden handles shuffle time does the exact opposite. It's a game that incentivizes thoughtfully choosing which cards to take and in what order, not only to get the best possible loadout, but also to reward the player for win streaks with sweep bonuses. If you play your cards right, you can cancel out negative effects with other arcanas. It also reintroduces minor arcanas for money, healing, and skill card rewards. Skill cards are a whole other thing that I'm planning to make a whole other video for, but for this game, I'd say this is one of the better implementations of this mechanic. Skill cards can start to get kinda busted in future Persona games. Oh, and of course, after spending hours re-rolling for skills in my low level challenge, I think I definitely prefer just being able to select skills to pass on in Fusion, with restrictions of course. This is probably the most obvious feature that just should have been in the original. In fact, it kinda baffles me how many other things Persona 4 added before manual skill inheritance. What, is Atlas really trying to tell me the slot machine minigame was a higher priority? Alright, I know I've been pretty critical of the original so far, but there are things about the original that work to its advantage over Golden. One of the first things people will point to is the balancing. However, I don't really think enough is being said about it. When most people talk about balancing, they're mostly just talking about the combat and how you're less OP. On a surface level, it might seem as though the most meaningful balancing changes are only prevalent towards the beginning of the game. Looking at just the raw stat data of all the enemies in the game might deceive you into thinking that. Hell, even I thought this before I replayed the game for this video. The changes that most people will tell you about first are probably Shadow Yukiko and Shadow Kanji. These fights were probably the most reworked out of any enemies in Golden. And for good reason too. In the original game, Shadow Yukiko had no weaknesses, while in Golden her counterpart is weak to ice. The prince she summons, however, is weak to ice, instead of Elec like in Golden. The Golden counterparts have much more HP though, to compensate for the extra weakness. A lot of people like to point out that Shadow Yukiko has Mind Charge in the original game. She doesn't use it often, but on the occasion that she does, it can be quite deadly. Shadow Kanji's fight is kinda cracked out though. He doesn't enrage the girls like in Golden, but he can still poison the guys, and poison is permanent in the original game. Or rather, it doesn't go away until you heal it or until the battle ends. The nice guy and tough guy assisting him in this fight also drain the elements they're weak to in Golden. To top it all off, nice guy doesn't just use Tarukaja on Shadow Kanji, he uses Heat Riser. Every turn. Now you understand why Yosuke gets to Kaja so early. These aren't all the differences, there are still other slight variations in their skill sets too, but those are the most prevalent details. Another change that I think is worth noting is how dungeon generation is handled. In Golden, just returning to the TV world entrance would reset the floor layouts. This includes treasure chests. In the original, this is not the case. For the first month of the game, there is no way to reset the dungeon floors without returning home and coming back another day. This means you won't be able to farm for chests. This might not seem like a big deal on a casual playthrough, but if you're someone who likes to clear the dungeon in one day, it's going to be very difficult. I couldn't even clear the first dungeon in a single day. This could segue into a conversation about resource and time management. I think something people don't really think about with these games is how the time management aspect of the game could also be considered part of the game's challenge. When it takes a whole day to regenerate a dungeon, you can't really stockpile items or grind for an indefinite amount of time. You would have to plan out how many days you're going to spend on a dungeon versus how many you're going to spend on social links and other activities. That's what I would say, but that all basically melts away by the second dungeon. You can pretty reasonably beat Kanji's dungeon in a single day if you're willing to use the fox to recover your SP. Once you're high enough level to fuse Sarasvati and it learns Invigorate too, you could just go back to the first floor of Yukiko's castle and sit on your ass until the protagonist regains all his SP. This cuts down the cost of SP recovery considerably. Oh, and more importantly, entering another dungeon will reset the layouts for the rest of them. So any talk of resource and time management goes out the window. Most of the enemies past Shadow Kanji are mostly the same between the original and Golden. There are some minor differences, like conditions for fusion forecast being looser. 2 new arcanas of personas were added, but most of them aren't really any more insane than what you could already get in the base game. So what's the big deal? What makes Golden easier than the original? Well, like I said way earlier in the video, it's the little things that add up. Party members can now use follow-up attacks regardless of if they're in your active party or not, so that means you can just get Chie's Galactic Punt whenever. And also, Risei's massive buffs. Gold Shadows also give a ton of XP now, while they only gave 1 XP in the original. They basically only existed for money in the original. If you're willing to go out of your way to hunt for them, you can gain tons of levels off them. Most people probably aren't going to do that unless you're preparing for the Margaret fight, which is the only case where I imagine you would be desperate enough for that much XP. I will concede, however, that the original is better balanced than Golden. It certainly has more exploitable mechanics. As much as I think Golden Shuffle Time is better as a bonus minigame, the rewards can be a bit too good and farmable. Powerful effects like Emperor giving your persona a free level up, and Magician being able to net you many more higher grade skills than the original really break the game if you just farm Shuffle Time off weak enemies until you get them. That being said, I still don't consider the original Persona 4 to be a very hard game. If you're expecting anything close to SMT or Persona 3 levels of challenge, you're out of luck. Persona 4 is what I personally consider to be a comfortable difficulty. You might die to a boss once, or get wrecked by the occasional encounter, but there are no points where I found myself needing to completely rethink my strategy. Persona 4 is only a hard game if you're trying to strictly follow a max social link guide. That shit is brutal. You miss one thing and suddenly you're behind in 5 different social links. It's a much more comfortable experience if you just do your own thing or use the guide as a reference. Even if you do complete every social link, there's a lot you're gonna miss out on. But hey, it's not Innocent Sin levels of easy. That alone is respectable in my eyes. Okay, this is the one point that I can say the original absolutely knocks Golden out of the water on. The visuals and presentation. I'm not talking about the screen resolution, by the way. I emulated the original in HD. I'm talking more about details. I'm usually of the mindset that, for most games, each subsequent re-release will lose more and more minute details from the original. It's kind of like a death by 1,000 cuts thing. It's only when they're compounded all at once when you really start to see the artistic direction start to change. These details are subtle, but do affect the overall mood and atmosphere of the game. You guys have probably already heard this, and you're probably tired of hearing it at this point, but the fog on PS2 is so much better looking. From as early as the beginning of the game, you can already tell the difference. The fog in the dream sequence is so much thicker and harder to see through, which works better within the context of the scene and what it symbolizes, being lost, directionless, and unable to make out the truth. In Golden, it looks more like Minecraft fog. Upon first entering Inaba, you really get more of a quiet town impression than an empty one, if you get what I mean. There's technically a very subtle layer of fog in every map at all times, and even that small detail can make a difference. The dungeons are especially affected by this change. They look less clean and polished and more oppressive in the original. A detail specific to the TV world that I really miss in Golden is the distortion effect. You can see this around the corners of the screen, not only affecting the game, but the UI and character portraits too. There was a similar filter to this in Persona 3 Fest during the Dark Hour as well. Then there's the assets and textures themselves. The greenery being more lush and that PS2 water are the most standout things. But plenty of other textures were also changed between the original and Golden. Pretty much all of them got a downgrade in the latter. And you wanna know the weirdest part? The assets debatably got worse when the game was later remastered for Persona's 25th anniversary. Font changes and even a few textures were changed. There is no officially stated reason for all of the visual changes between the original and Golden. All we can do is sort of speculate. It could be just a difference between renderware and whatever in-house engine they used for Golden. It could have been an issue of converting one engine's assets to be compatible with the other. Something PS Vita LED screen, or hell, Maybe the change in atmosphere was entirely intentional. It's noticeable before you even start the game. It might be easy to jump to conclusions and assume that the PS Vita's hardware just couldn't handle it, but realistically it could have been a number of different factors. Obviously, graphics aren't everything, but doesn't it kinda suck when the best looking version of the game is also the one missing all the features you like? Doesn't it kinda sting that the version most people are going to play is the visually butchered one? So what now? Does this mean we have to choose between atmosphere or gameplay improvements? Is the artistic integrity of the original game lost forever? Well, not quite, viewer. There's actually a mod for the PC version of Persona 4 Golden being worked on that restores the original look of the game's fog. This, in tandem with turning the contrast setting down to 2, will help the game resemble the original game's look more closely. I've been keeping up with the progress of this mod since its inception because, well, yeah, who doesn't want a mod that restores the original look of the game? Just look at Sonic Adventure DX, pretty much everyone plays that game with Dreamcast restoration mods these days. Shoutouts to Brawler and all the other hardworking modders on the team for taking on this honorable task. Unfortunately, there are no mods at the time of making this video that restore all those other visual differences, like the textures and the TV distortion filter. But hey, the door is always open for one. I'm normally very against using mods on a first playthrough of a game, but only if they alter the gameplay. Purely aesthetic mods like this one, or something like the Persona 1 music patch, that are restorative in nature are typically okay in my book. But I'm not gonna be one of those people and tell you that you absolutely must play the game with this mod that I like, or it's unplayable. Persona 4 Golden is fine the way it is. This is just a nice and inoffensive visual enhancement if you want it. Wow, that ended up being way longer than I was expecting it to be, but hopefully now you can see how much the changes between the original and Golden really impact the game. See, the problem isn't that base P4 is bad per se, the issue is that for every good thing Persona 4 adds, it removes like 5 other things that absolutely did not have to be removed. I suspect for most people at the time, they really only cared about party member social links and direct party control. Don't get me wrong, I understand those were probably the 2 most wanted things. I just don't understand why those things had to come at a cost. Like, in principle, most of the complaints towards Persona 3 can amount to, there just isn't enough there. But if that's the case, there shouldn't have been any trade-off for the things people asked for. The worst part about it is that a lot of the things they took away kinda went under a lot of people's noses, like some sort of tricky insurance contract. I get that Persona 4 was built off Persona 3 and slapped together in only 2 years, but I don't think it's unfair to expect the newer entry of a series to offer more than its predecessor, and more than just a few select things. Nowadays, most of the things I've mentioned are pretty irrelevant. Golden addresses a good amount of my qualms with the original, and most people in this day and age have never played the original, so they'd never know. This does kind of raise the concern of how re-releases, remasters, and remakes of the sort will slowly start to overwrite the original's existence. Or in the case of Golden, the original becomes conflated with it. People don't even really know the difference and assume it's all the same but with slightly less quality of life. But I'm hoping that through preservation and the abundance of information online about these games, the distinction and memory of the original is still left intact, even if I prefer the newer one over the older one. It's through knowing these distinctions that people can truly come to appreciate one over the other, or both for that matter. In conclusion, the Fog Restoration mod eliminates any reason to go back to the original game, and further validates Persona 4 Golden's position as the superior way to play Persona 4. Sorry, that's just how it is. I don't make the rules around here. There's no use arguing or even entertaining any alternative perspectives. Don't bother. If you see any other videos talking about this topic, feel free to disregard them completely. Don't even think about going over to Nam's Compendium's channel right now to watch his video, which may or may not have gone up at the same exact time as this one. He's wrong. Don't trust a word he says. Guy's never had a right opinion in his life. He's just a big ol' Persona 4 elitist.
You're wrong.
Nope.
You're wrong.
Nope.
Original's better.
Golden's
Original's
Golden's
better. Persona 4 Golden,
more like Persona
Fraud.
Fraud.
Bronze.
Your version is too
Clearly,
old.
you
It's
just don't
outdated.
respect the
Golden has
artistic
more
integrity
friendship
of not being able to use the
because it's
Velvet Room at night.
friendship
You can't
game,
appreciate
and unlike
the
Seas or the
genius
Phantom
behind using the
Thieves,
DualShock 2's
investigation
vibration
team
for
actually
fishing. The
feel
Golden
like
Persona 4
friends.
Goldens worth about as much as a chocolate coin wrap.